Let go of the camera. So when
Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Trevor Carmichael Wall Garden Theatre. We are very, very pleased to have you here this evening for this very important lecture and this discourse about the life and the contributions of Christopher Codrington and Codrington College to our history. I'd like to recognize the presence of the president of the Barbados National Trust, Mr. Jeff Ramsey. Of course, the author of this book, Dr. Lennox Honychurch, Miss Sally Miller of Miller Publishing, who has published the book, and of course our director, Miss Alessandra Cummings. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. And at this time, I'd like to welcome our director, Alessandra Cummings, to make some welcome remarks.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a special pleasure to welcome you all here. We believe in the point of opportune moments. And Lennox's new book comes out of, I think you said almost 10 years research, Lennox.
Yes.
On and off, 10 years.
And then an intense 5 or 6.
So we are very, very happy to have this opportunity to have him speak to members and friends of the Barbados Museum and to the heritage community in general. Jeff, welcome. It's always good to have you in partnership as well. Well, I know that you didn't really come here to hear me. You came here to hear the author. But I did want to give a special welcome because Lennox has been a long-time supporter of the Barbados Museum and of heritage in Barbados in general, through both public presentations, publications, particularly in our journal, offering collections, offering new interpretations of Caribbean history, and it's no surprise that we would have a genuine interest in a book like this on Codrington College and on its founder, or rather its donning founder, because in this current environment, we still have a lot to learn about where Barbadian history, Caribbean history comes from, and there's evolving thought and ideas that need to be addressed. Lennox has done that in a highly readable publication. I would recommend it to anybody to make time to ensure that they get their copy. Great reading, and then it's not just about Christopher Codrington and Codrington College. There are all of these different tendrils around so many different things, both preceding Codrington and after the founding of the college and into the present. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lennox Honychurch, good friend and colleague, and good supporter of museums both here and there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And of course, now the all-important introduction of our author and our speaker for this evening, Dr. Lennox Honychurch. I know everyone here probably has a very good idea who he is already, but we must observe the formalities. So at this time, I'd like to invite Mrs. Sally Miller to the podium to do the honors.
Thank you very much, Kay, and good afternoon to all of you. I just thought we'd rock up and Lennox would give a lovely lecture. So I was a little unprepared, but I must introduce our dear friend and author, and give him his due this afternoon. I published this book on behalf of the committee chair, Sir Trevor Carmichael, and the committee of the 275th anniversary of the founding of Lodge School and Codrington College. And this book is about the extraordinary bequest that created the two institutions. Under the leadership of Sir Trevor Carmichael, the Codrington College 275th anniversary worked hard to raise the funds needed to publish the book, and also hosted a public lecture at the Lodge School in September 2010. And we owe a deep debt of gratitude to the author, Dr. Lennox Honychurch, for his enthusiasm and dedication to this project. His commitment saw him traveling frequently between Dominica and Barbados, delivering that memorable lecture, and working closely with our committee. We also want to remember, before Lennox starts, with appreciation to the late Dr. Carl Watson, who shared his insights and expertise with Lennox during the course of this research. Now, a few words about Lennox, although I think almost everyone here could write this for me. Dr. Honychurch, Dominican by birth, Barbadian by descent, attended the Lodge School here in Barbados and later earned both a master's and a doctorate at St. Hugh's College, Oxford, as a Chevening Scholar. He has served as Senator in the Dominica House of Assembly, written extensively on Caribbean history, and contributed to the preservation of our region's heritage through his work as a historian, artist, and museum consultant. He restored Fort Shirley in Dominica's Cabritz National Park, co-founded the Museum Association of the Caribbean, and received many honors, including the Anthony N. Sabga Caribbean Award for Excellence, an honorary doctorate from the University of the West Indies, and the Dominica Award of Honor, his nation's highest accolade. Dr. Honychurch's work continues to celebrate the deep connections between our islands and our shared history, and today's book stands as yet another testament to that. It is now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Lennox Honychurch to present to us.
Good afternoon to everyone. Lovely to see you here. Thank you for coming out on your Sunday afternoon, when most of you all should be relaxing in your hammocks for this event. It gives me great pleasure to present the book and also to give you an overview of the contents and my ideas in relation to its composition. I was asked by the committee to do something on the history of the Codrington College and, of course, its associated educational institutions. Thank you very much. Its associated institutions, the Lodge School and Codrington High School, which were not part of the original bequest. But as I will mention in my presentation, Codrington was very clever in leaving a clause which said, okay, we're going to appoint this committee under the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and they will, in effect, add other aspects to this bequest. Although, as I'm going to mention, that he specified the college. And then, of course, he had the other bequest, which I don't deal with too much. That is the library at All Souls in Oxford itself. Now, the first part of the book, I basically give an outline of my association with what I'm writing about, because it's amazing, a series of coincidences over time in my life that really prepared me for writing this book. The fact that I went to the Lodge School up in St. John, and that I, as a student of the Lodge School, visited very often down to Codrington College for one reason or another, but mostly in my last years as a member of the Lodge School swimming team. That's about the only sport I really had any interest in at the Lodge School. So I would go down there with members of the team, and we would use the swimming tank, if you want to call it. It was really a square, maybe about, if I recall correctly, 20 feet long, and the fresh spring water flowing right through. And so we would swim there and prepare for the inter-island schools meets and that kind of thing. So essentially that and the other events related to Codrington College, I had that experience going through it. And then, of course, many of the people who taught me at school were graduates of Codrington College. People like Reverend Woodruff, who at one time was principal, and Percy Critchlow, Newsom, and Hoyas, of course, one of my mentors, Fabi Hoyas, as we used to call him. All of them were products of Codrington College. So I had that background in terms of having a vague knowledge of the place. And then, by luck and chance and the good offices of the British High Commission, I was able to get a scholarship to go to Oxford and under the Chevening Scholarship. And there I actually was going to do history. There was a course, Empire and Commonwealth History. I got in, I was settled in, and then I got a very apologetic phone call to say, we're so sorry, but the course has been cut. Never told me how, for what reason or whatever, but there is another opening, and judging from your resume, maybe you could do anthropology. So I said, yes, fine, I would do anything. I mean, you know, whatever course was going, I'd already got my feet in the door. So that is what I did, anthropology, but interestingly enough, what I was intending to do in the history department, I did in anthropology, which is a book that I have already published about the indigenous people of Dominica and the Eastern Caribbean. Resistance, Refuge, Revival, the indigenous Kalinagos of Dominica. But while I was there, and this is the link with Codrington, one of my lecturers, a guy called John Davis, we happened to be talking about where I came from and what my previous education was and that kind of thing. And I casually mentioned that I had been a student of the Lodge School in Barbados. I pricked up and he said, oh, well, you must come down to All Souls. And the doors were open, as I mentioned in the book, with excited invitations. And I had some great times down there because there were very interesting seminars, historical seminars. Of course, there was use of the library, and the library still held many of his original books from when he was a pupil, both at St. John's Church before he left for England as a 12-year-old, and also in his early years at a sort of, call it secondary school at Enfield in North London. So all these books, so he had written in my book, this is my book. And so I really was very fortunate, as well as attending the seminars, and then afterwards, in true Christopher Codrington's style, I felt. We would repair to the upper rooms and drink wine and continue chatting about our seminars. And I asked the principal once, I said, "But who's paying for all this wine? Where is it?" He says, in true Oxford fashion, the mother of one of the students left in her will money for the rest of time for wine for post-seminar discussion. I thought that was a very civilized thing, but as I put in the book, it gave me the understanding and the feeling of this repartee, this elegant sort of setting and the discussion that continued afterwards in the manner of Christopher Codrington. So essentially, the book is divided into two parts. I had a problem too of compressing, as I may have even this afternoon, but anybody like my dear publisher, Sally Miller, she may put up her hand if things are going on too long. But essentially, it's divided into half, because I felt that it's not just a matter of earnestly giving an account of Codrington's life, basically in chronological order, but it was important to give the background of the society in which he lived and the milieu in which he mixed. And as I say, you know, his life was kaleidoscopic. And when you think it is the 17th century and you're traveling by sailing ship across the Atlantic back and forth, and on his trips across the English Channel to assist King William III in his summer battles against the French for the sake of the Netherlands and particularly Flanders. It's amazing that he packed all this in, and it wasn't just a matter of going across the Atlantic once and coming back to Barbados. It's about 3 times, you know, in a sailing ship. So, and then of course he did a number of things. He was not just an absentee planter. In fact, a lot of his life was being the Commander-in-Chief and Governor-General of the Leeward Islands. So whereas when I was at Lodge and I was brought up with this sort of hagiographic life of Codrington, it was always seemed to be set in Barbados. But much of his life was spent in the Leeward Islands and also in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom and over in the Netherlands. So the book is sort of divided in those 2 halves until he dies, because he returned first to Antigua, and then life in Antigua was getting very complex, very hurtful to him, because there was a governor that succeeded him, which pure jealousy was making his life hell. And he was feeling very ill and down because he had got malaria and dysentery in one of the campaigns that he had waged against the French in Guadeloupe. And he decided to retreat to Codrington, to what was called Concepts. And I deal also, to understand the wealth that he had, I deal with his early family in Barbados. And in fact, his ancestor, great-grandfather, John Codrington, very early in the English adventures in establishing colonies in the New World, sailed with the Godspeed and 3 other ships among the Jamestown settlers, those settlers that were going up to Virginia to establish a colony, an English colony in what became Jamestown in Virginia. So essentially, because of the wind patterns, they would sail down to the Eastern Caribbean and then pass through the islands and go up to the eastern seaboard of what became the United States, and there they established their first settlement that survived. John went back to England very soon afterwards, but he had remembered his adventures through the islands, and then his grandson, one had a son called Robert. Robert developed their properties up in Gloucestershire, and then one of them came down to settle in Barbados very shortly after the 1627 establishment of the first settlement here in Barbados. And so it progresses, and then you have the first Codringtons born in the Caribbean, born in Barbados, John and Christopher. And what makes it extremely complex when you're researching this, or even in describing in the book, is that they all used the Christian names of Christopher, William, and John. And it even makes it more complex because, and I'll do a special one on this, where the father of our Christopher Codrington has a child with one of his enslaved women and christens him William. And so you get a little confused about who are the inside Williams and who are the outside Williams. And he leaves in his will money and freedom for his little boy, the inside William. And also, what's that? The outside William, yes, that's true. But also the inside William because he was left land in Antigua and what else. So you see already, I mean, inside, outside, I was somewhat confused. So that is essentially, the book is half and half. And then we get into, as the first chapter of that section says, the first years of struggle. And this is the point of the book, and this is the point of the title. It's a will to deliver, so it has a double meaning. It's a will, noun, was produced, and you have to deliver the will as the person who made the will wants to leave their property and their possessions. But it's also the determination. Will in the essence of determination and commitment to carry it out right up to the present day. And the difficulties that they have had over the years, I catalogue, for instance, the two major hurricanes that affected the property, that is in 1780, and of course the famous one in 1831. And the fact you have to rebuild and you have to deal with putting yourself back on your feet. And then the erratic nature of funding the whole thing. It's one thing for Codrington to have left money for the construction and to a certain extent for the running of the plantation. But the problem was that sugar prices went up and down. There were the hurricane storms. There was the difficulty of getting staff to come. And also in the initial stages, the will was challenged because he had included this section about having celibate priests. And this was considered to be too popish. Now you must understand too, at that time, there was a great religious controversy going on at that time and in the earlier period because you had, besides Cromwell and his Puritans and the Commonwealth, you also had the issue of Charles II not having any children, and then the crown going to James II, who actually was a very staunch Roman Catholic and was determined to bring England back into the Roman Catholic fold. And this created a great issue, and James's son decided to raise a group to try to claim the crown, well known as the Monmouth Rebels, because he was Earl of Monmouth, and that was very seriously defeated. So all of these are issues that affected the gestation of Codrington's idea of the seminary, theological college, and of course of the running of the plantation. So this is the first time that I am operating this on a laptop. I was hoping to print out all the pages and be waving hard copy paper. This is a new era, so I've got to slip into it. Great, so I deal with Christianity and colonization at the beginning, and the basis of colonization and the Christianity that went with it to ensure it was very much part of the colonization adventure. But the problem was that in Barbados, in the early days, they really could not find reliable priests, reliable clerics to actually begin the administration, if you want, of the Anglican faith in Barbados, because they were very much, as is described here, diverted and encouraged to live the life of planters, and they certainly weren't the best quality in relation to being administrators and purveyors of the English religion in these parts. And essentially what happened was that this was one of the main things that Codrington was concerned about in his will. He wanted to establish what essentially was a theological college to train priests, not only for Barbados, but throughout the West Indies. And that was another challenge. So also there's the whole question of the land on which they did this. So I spent some time establishing the fact, because as I said, I wanted to, when are you never going to get an opportunity again to produce a book like this? So I wanted to itemize all of the different aspects, not just take the existence of Consets Estate, or did Martin up on the higher estate, which became society and is society today. Just take it for granted and then continue the story. I wanted to explain these places. So I mentioned there, as if by design, the Codringtons had pieced together one of the most ecologically advantageous corners of Barbados, composed of a number of physical features ideal for development of a productive sugar plantation. And in fact, it precedes the sugar plantation because they were running it in the pre-sugar days, and it was extremely productive. I described the cliff that separates the upper and lower sections of the plantation, and the nature, the natural features of it, and the ecological valuable plants that were used by the enslaved and previously by the Amerindians. I talk about the bay, that is Consets Bay, which really was one of the best bays in the east, protected by coral reefs, full of a variety of wildlife in relation to the sea. So I described all of that. The spring, it's one of the best springs in the island, and I mentioned the others like Pori Spring and the others in the caves, like Harrison Cave, Coles Cave, and whatever. So Codrington had this wonderful piece of land, and then I talk about the Amerindian occupation and the clay objects that remain and the clay that existed, which enabled them to construct these bowls and stuff that archaeologists have found, and also provided the Codringtons with the clay to make the pots that they were used in the making of sugar, where you put clay over these clay pots, if you want, which look rather like the upside down of a dunce's cap with a hole at the bottom, so that all the molasses drained out and you had a clearer sugar. So all of this was great, but the problem was that Codrington, the father, Christopher, got into big trouble because he swung a most devious land grab by basically stealing Consett from the original owners. Consett, Mr. and Mrs. Consett, he was also a colonel in the militia and all that, they lived on what is the Codrington College lands today. And they were partially blind, and as the letters show, they were somewhat illiterate. That's what the letters say, was somewhat illiterate. And Codrington, who was their neighbor by then, he was living on what we today call society on the upper estate. befriended them and played, you know, his lads, assistance to them. And then Codrington, twisted the terms of the inheritance. They had planned to bequeath this estate to the nephew of Willoughby, who was the governor of the day. But Codrington, with the assistance of a lawyer in Bridgetown, Justice Sharp, they manipulated the text of the will and left a blank space for Codrington to sign in the presence of the semi-blind Consett. And they didn't know anything about it. Consett died without realizing it. And then at the very end, his wife found out with great alarm. The book describes how she was so distraught by this sleight of hand. But in any case, it was all properly done in terms of the legal process, and that's how Codrington got Consett. Now, to make it a little more confusing, there were these two brothers, John and Christopher, and their mother had actually been a Drax who married a Codrington. And essentially what happened is that the two brothers, John had bought the land, wild, untamed, forested land over in the east, and Christopher had bought the land down in St. Michael, which today still is called Codrington, but it's better known as Waterford and even better known now as the Botanical Gardens land. And then they exchanged it. So John came to live in St. Michael, and Christopher went to live on the land over at Society, which at that time was called Martin because that was their property in Gloucestershire. So Christopher was on the make, and he did a whole set of other things, which I mentioned. He was in a deal to do with getting St. Lucia from the French and all. And he was Speaker of the House, he was the representative for the parish of St. John in the House of Assembly, all of that sort of thing. But boy, he was a manipulator. And he then realized that Antigua was opening up, and so he went up to Antigua, and by other devious methods, and being in the right place at the right time, he essentially had Betty's Hope and other plantations in Antigua and in St. Kitts, and the whole island of Barbuda, which he got on a lease. So, you know, there was a lot of manipulation there, but it also shows where the money was coming from to finance the will of Christopher Codrington. So I go into all of that because I felt it's necessary that if you want to look up the origins of the plantations, you will get that. I have a section moving in to give that social background of the time of Barbadian society. It talks about the Creoles, and I deal with the white West Indians and balancing their loyalties between their imagined England, because some of them were born here and they knew nothing about England, but they were bred, they were built up, they were trained in this concept of this wonderful England that was over there that they had never visited, but yet they had great loyalties to the Barbados in which they were born. So I discuss this and the way in which it goes on through the generations to the mid-20th century, when issues related to this were still issues that the Lodge School had to deal with, or even Codrington College, the creation and maintaining of an elite. And then I deal with the free collar because the first number of the first clerics who were trained at Codrington College after the 1830s were of that group. And I think it's a society that Barbadian historians have not dealt with in the depth that I would have hoped. Yes, there's a lot of concentration on the black enslaved and that kind of thing, of the white from the beginning of the colonization. But the free-colored are kind of left in the background, and I don't think sufficient research and publication has been done on them, although there are pockets of very interesting stuff. but essentially they got on board as well in the whole Codrington College adventure. And so we have what I call Codrington's dilemma, as he was split between this Barbados, which was his home and where he had grown up until he went to England to school, and England, where he was feted and became quite a name. I use section chapter 5 called A Youth from the Indies, because that is how he was seen when he went up to Britain, to Oxford. He was this exotic guy that had turned up on the Christchurch campus of the Christchurch College in England. So he was trained in his first 12 years at St. John's Church by the rector, but also at St. John's Church at the time, until he was about 11 years old, was Ferdinando Pali, and I always mispronounce this, so Paleolos. Thank you. Give it to me, Sir Henry. He was last in the line of the Christian emperors of Byzantium. As one of the family, Fernando's ancestors had been routed by the Muslim Ottoman invasion of Constantinople 2 centuries before, when the final outpost of the Eastern Roman Empire collapsed. Over many generations, the family retreated to England, from where Ferdinando emigrated to Barbados. And he worked a small pineapple plantation in St. John, which appears on the Ford map of the island, not far from St. John's Church. So essentially, he assisted also with the early education of young Christopher. And by the time Christopher was 12 years old, or as the records say, as soon as he was considered to be of an age to undergo the hardships of a voyage, he set sail for England to secure the benefits of an English education. This was a literal rite of passage embarked upon by the sons and indeed often by some of the daughters of the leading planters of the island. The sea voyages were long and perilous, and the children remained in Europe for many years before returning to the Caribbean, if ever they returned at all. And Codrington was sent to a highly recommended school in Enfield in North London, where he established his early years of formal education. And then I describe all the issues that were going on in England at the time with, as I mentioned earlier, King Charles. He had just died, leaving the throne to his unpopular Catholic brother, James II. Charles had no legitimate heirs, and his eldest illegitimate son, the Protestant Duke of Monmouth, led a rebellion in the West Country against the Catholic king, his uncle, in the hope of taking the throne. He arrived in Dorset, and the revolution began, called sometimes the Pitchfork Rebellion. It ended in a mass slaughter of Monmouth's followers at Sedgemoor in Somerset. News of the battle swept into Oxford as Codrington arrived. Monmouth was beheaded, and his followers were treated with peculiar ferocity. The bloody assizes under Lord Chief Justice George Jeffreys executed 300 people and flogged or transported hundreds more. Just over 400 of those condemned to be transported were shipped to Barbados as the Monmouth rebels. Of the 305 who survived the wretched sea voyage, most labored as political prisoners, joining the gangs of indentured redlegs, blistering pink in the tropical sun. As the usefulness of the forced white labor declined, many of them ended up living in abject poverty in thatched huts under the cliff near to Constance and Martin's Bay in St. John, and in other rugged areas of eastern Barbados. And so we find that the lodge school that is set up because they realized that they were having difficulty getting people to train clerics, they decided, okay, we'll start with a school. And so the school started in 1745, and overwhelmingly all of the boys who attended were descendants of indentured labor, so-called poor whites, who attended that school. Even my notes are along, but this is the kind of nature of the book in that I'm giving the background to it all. And the background, of course, also to Christopher Codrington's book collection. He collected and he had people go out throughout Europe buying books on his behalf. And he became a favorite of William III. And I deal with this because it appears that William III was bisexual, and he had a lot of beautiful, particularly Dutch young men who he brought to England, and others who he nurtured and encouraged, and who he gave titles. So he has some of them writing to him and saying, find themselves in a very difficult position and they've never been accused of this before. And then William replies that just because I'm friendly with a young man, why do I have to be a criminal? That kind of thing. So it's interesting that banter that's going on there, and Codrington was very much part of that. One of his best friends was the bisexual Lord Stanhope. We have some incidents in his life which I touch on, which essentially give a taste of this. Yes, so the Duke of Portland, who is one of them, says, "The kindness which your Majesty has for a young man, and the way in which you seem to authorize his liberties, make the world say things that I am ashamed to hear." This, he said, was tarnishing a reputation which has never before been subject to such accusations. And then King William replies tersely, he dismissed these suggestions, saying, "It seems to me very extraordinary that it should be impossible to have esteem and regard for a young man without being a criminal. Such sentiments could have equally been applied to Codrington because he was part of that milieu. But Codrington became very careful about all of this, and I go on into all his dealings in London and the Molly houses and the characters with which he mixed in Paris and London. Essentially, he said, "Look, I don't want to be like my father, who was, for various reasons, so criticized, and I want to maintain my good name." So you could see it clear that he's playing very, very carefully. And also what happens is that when they go to Barbados, they get a lease. The father gets a lease for Barbados. But then when Christopher Codrington's friendship with William gets deeper, William changes the lease to a gift. So he gives Christopher Codrington the whole of Barbados, and it actually remained in the Codrington family until 1870, when it then was incorporated with the colony of Antigua. And now the Prime Minister of Antigua is handing huge chunks of it out over the heads of the Barbadian people to all kinds of wealthy crooks who are coming down. It's just a kind of complete repeat of the 17th century over the heads of the present-day Barbadians, administered by the new chieftains of the island. That is, in the case, I can call his name Gaston Brown, you know, he's doing this. And they are up in arms because they have the traditional ownership, communal ownership of Barbados in the days of the Codringtons, and now it's being turned. So I deal with all of that, of the Codringtons' manipulation. And then we have return and entreat. So what happens is Codrington's father dies, and he basically is executor to his will, and he has to take on all of these things, both in the Leeward Islands and in Barbados, and manage them, and also share out portions to his cousin, who is called William Codrington, who gains land mostly in the Leeward Islands. And the will of the father. Now this is one of the things that I think that early scholarship has neglected. They focus on the will of our, I call him our Christopher Codrington, our sort of Barbadian, the man of Barbadian link with college and all. The famous will of Christopher Codrington III, related to the establishment of Codrington College and the building of the Library at Oxford, has overshadowed the will of his father. But the will of the senior Codrington is fascinating in its own right, not least because it provided the handsome inheritance that his son would pass on to others. Indeed, his father's will has been largely overlooked in telling the Codrington story. It is interesting on many levels, particularly of the bequests that were left to his formerly enslaved black mistresses and illegitimate children, the distribution of which became the responsibility of his son, heir, and executor. That is our Codrington. The will had been made in Antigua and recorded thus. Christopher Codrington, Captain General of His Majesty's Leeward Caribbean Islands, will dated 15th July 1698, proved October 1698, by his son and executor. So our William was the executor. Now, an interesting thing crops up, where people have told me, oh, but Codrington, Christopher Codrington of Codrington College had a son. It's in his will. But what they haven't understood is that the father's will leaves this boy for our Christopher Codrington to take care of. So our Christopher Codrington has to mention in his will this son called William, who he says is to be freed, and he recommends him going to school in England and all that kind of stuff. And eventually that boy comes back from England, having gone to school and all, but he doesn't come back to Antigua or Barbados. He buys a piece of land in Jamaica. And there still is, on the eastern side of Jamaica, a Codrington Bay. And he called the estate that he developed there Betty's Hope, after the estate that he had been born on in Antigua. So, you know, in research, sometimes you have to sort of wind your way between all of these things. The other thing is that Codrington, our Codrington, his brother, John, younger brother, was not of sound mind. Of course, in the text and the wills and so, he is described as a lunatic. And the brilliant Christopher III was unmarried and unlikely to become so, for it was clear that he was not really interested in women except as social adornments and adoring admirers of his wit. This is reflected in the fact that nowhere in the will of Christopher III is a female beneficiary mentioned except for a bequest to his cousin, Mrs. Rachel Cawthorpe, who was also the widow of one of his closest comrades in arms who had been killed in battle in Flanders. And to her was bequeathed all my estate in St. Christopher and the moiety of my island and Barbuda. So all of that is dealt with there. And then his problems with being, that's another thing that King William handed to him, was to be made Captain General of the Leeward Islands on the 16th of October, 1689. And on succeeding the governorship, he settled his affairs in England before coming out. And then he bought a large estate of Doddington from his cousin Samuel Codrington, with the intention that he would retire there as an absentee planter once his official duties on the island were over. But as fate would have it, another branch of the Codringtons would enjoy this prize. And they would develop the mansion that is there today. And Christopher remained here and died here instead. Then another important influence that has not been mentioned anywhere in the in any accounts of Codrington is his link with the outstanding priest of the Dominican order, Père Jean-Baptiste Labat. So with Labat, who is quite a character in his own right, who runs plantations, enslaved plantations. So it's something that Codrington becomes very interested in. They meet at a dinner in St. Kitts, and as Labat says, he asked me 100 questions, and the relationship continued by correspondence, because Codrington wanted to work out how do you run a slave plantation to raise money for Christian missions? And so that whole relationship is of great interest. And also, Labatt, because this meeting is discussed by one of the leading Caribbean writer, Gordon Lewis. Well, he's not actually Caribbean, but he did a lot of work in the Caribbean. As they conversed in St. Kitts at this dinner, as the academic Gordon Lewis enthuses, it reveals two European men of the world, both knowledgeable in West Indian affairs, playing the gentleman courtier with each other. It's not too much to say that Codrington, educated as he had been in the Oxford of John Locke, brought to the West Indies for the first time the energizing spirit of liberal Anglicanism. It was not, it goes without saying, an abolitionist spirit, because Codrington himself realized that he couldn't do much in terms of making life easier or ameliorating the life of the slaves. And I talk about the fact that the planters of Barbados were very critical of him even doing what he did in his will. A will was almost overturned because it was considered to be rather dangerous in the light of present circumstances. I go back to Ligon, for instance, where Ligon, that is back in the 1640s, 50s, where Ligon asks a planter, you know, this guy is so intelligent, this is talking about an enslaved man on the estate where Ligon is working. And, you know, he's interested in the Bible and Christianity, he can read and whatever. And the owner of the plantation is telling him, no, 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 we don't go there because you will open up, essentially, in other words, a can of worms. So essentially, that is it, in that they have this whole life here and in Antigua. And eventually, Christopher goes and fights a battle off Guadeloupe, because the wars between the French and the English have started over the contest of islands because of the rise in the wealth of the sugar production. And I'll just mention briefly Labatt's things. Thanks to a written account by Labatt, we have some insight into what was discussed at that table that night and the spirited repartee of the occasion. It also gives us a rare insight into the much commented on, but seldom recorded debonair self-assurance and wit of Christopher Codrington himself. They all conversed in French, as the academic Gordon Lewis enthuses, and I mentioned these gentlemen courtiers of the world. Their discussion ranged from the untrustworthiness of Irish Catholic labourers as mercenaries on the islands, to Codrington's interest in the method of missionary work among the slaves in the French Antilles. And they leave after about 3 hours of dinner, and Labatt records a rather alarming little scene. I'll say it here just because it gives another insight into the way of the world. If any of you all get the chance, or if you haven't done it already, if you go into the Cunard Gallery, you'll see a painting of the governor going from Pilgrim going down into Bridgetown with runners and buglers and all that. So Labatt describes the same thing happening in the night when they come and they pick up Christopher Codrington to go wherever he was staying. And he had these enslaved people running along, and 9 or 10 Negroes ran in front of the trumpeters, although their horses always traveled at a canter or a very quick entrepas. I felt sorry for a small Negro boy about 15 years old who was being taught to be a runner. He only wore a pair of pants without a seat, but was made to take even this garment off and run naked in front of everyone. He was followed by a Negro with a whip, which was applied every time he came within range and slowed down. The image remained with Labat into his memoirs, published many years later, of the stripped, totally naked, pubescent youth, lit by flaming torches held aloft, running before Codrington and being whipped every so often in a scene of homoerotic relish that disappeared into the night to the sound of trumpets. This gives another insight into the whole life of the times and also of Codrington. And conscious of the accusations of wild living, embezzlement, and even treason, which had been leveled against his father and which had irreparably damaged his name, young Christopher wrote, inverted commas, "I shall take special care that my reputation do not suffer for want of due inquiry as my father's did." So he was, making himself quite clearly setting himself away from all these things because he wanted to protect his reputation. Then I have a section there on the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. I won't go into detail, but there were many organizations set up by the guy who set up the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. But one that stands out, of course, is that one. Thomas Bray, 1656, 1730, the founder of the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, was a prudish, deeply conservative Church of England minister who worked tirelessly for several causes which he believed would promote Christian values to enhance the Anglican Church, not only in Britain, but also in the newly emergent colonies abroad. He had other things that he'd done, like the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. And he was a very active and well-meaning Christian, but essentially the bodies that he set up were very kind of tight and prim and proper, and especially in relation to the one for education. So ultimately, when the Codrington estates became the property of the SPG, the senior clerics became the absentee owners of the West India plantations and the slaves thereon. And they were kept informed by richly detailed records of their property's operation. And as the historian Adam Hochschild puts it, quote, "The absentee owner for whom all these careful accounts were prepared was not a person, it was not a family, it was the Church of England." And he goes to list all of the officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, who are on this committee to run this place 5,000 miles away. Very challenging, once again. And the idea to make a bequest of funds to open and maintain a college was also influenced by the long-established precedents that Codrington had witnessed during his years at Oxford. For example, Nicholas Wadham, founder of Wadham College, was, I quote, often to say that he had a good estate and had no children to leave it to, and his kindred to whom he thought to leave his estate did not care for him, unquote. This was the same predicament that Christopher found himself in when he composed his will in 1702. He had a cousin, William Codrington, to whom he could have left all his estates, but William likewise did not care for him. So Codrington followed the example of Wadham, who in turn had followed the example of Sir Thomas Bodley, founder of the Bodleian Library. Wadham was advised to do as Sir Thomas Bodley has done, as he has built a library. So you build a college, and you shall be remembered every day. I would almost add, and be argued over every day. It will last from generation to generation. So Mr. Wadham proceeded and did all according to his counsel, unquote. And indeed, the Bodleian Library stands to this day across the street from Codrington's library at Oxford and across the Atlantic Ocean from his college in Barbados. Go on with the challenges of the church and the planters, and in the will when he talks about the main points of his will and the practice of physic and chirurgery as intended by Codrington was interpreted as physic, natural philosophy, physics, the science, art or practice of medicine, anything healing or wholesome, from the Greek psychos, natural, physis, nature, and also surgery, like with the work of hands. And so the will actually, if you study it, very simple, but it makes no mention of educating slaves directly or ever establishing a grammar school for boys. All that was inherited later by the trustees. Codrington's idea was focused on the improvement of the quality of the clergy, and it was by their ministry and through their commitment of doing good to men's souls while taking care of their bodies that West Indian society would be improved. On top of all this, the income of the society's plantations were unpredictable, rising and falling because of bad management, fluctuating sugar prices, intermittent wars in the Caribbean, and dislocation of shipping and damage to property by crops by hurricanes. The effects of periods of drought, disease to the canes, added to the precarious nature of production and profits. This was what the institution had to depend on for its subsistence. I go into the whole business of the philosophy of slavery at the time and the philosophical influences on Codrington. We know that he was very close to Locke and Locke's ideas, and it's interesting that Locke was writing the Constitution of South Carolina, where Barbadians had gone to establish a new colony. He talks about Hans Sloane. Sloane was in Barbados on his way to take the wife of the Duke of Albemarle to Jamaica, and actually he visits the Codrington area and has a map where he shows the main features of Consets and all that. So we have these, and Defoe, Daniel Defoe, their ages didn't necessarily match Codrington's, but Codrington was influenced by their work and their attitudes. I go into all of that, which I will not do now, all of his mentors, where Daniel Defoe said, the case is as plain as cause and consequence. Mark the climax. No Africa trade, no Negroes. No Negroes, no sugars, ginger, indicos, etc. No sugars, etc., no islands. No islands, no continent. No continent, no trade. And that was his little line, basically linking everything. And then in relation to what Codrington dynasty had done, to paraphrase Defoe, quote, no slavery, no trade. No trade, no profits. No profits, no legacy. No legacy, no college. And for that matter, no library at Oxford or grammar school at the Lodge. So you can see all the linkages going on up there. And then we get into the composing of his will and essentially what was going through his mind at the time. But after fighting a disastrous battle with the French, and also being very badly treated while he was governor of the Leeward Islands by the society, but also by certain people who really were either jealous or totally against it, he basically lost strength and determination. He called it, on January the 7th, 1705, he wrote to his old friend, the Earl of Peterborough, that he was blind from time to time and complained of his broken constitution. He devoted a few of his remaining years in Barbados to the study of religion and philosophy, reading the works of early church fathers and discussing these with his close friend and chaplain, Reverend William Gordon, then rector of St. James. Christopher Codrington died suddenly on Good Friday, 7th April, 1710, in the mansion house at Consets. The funeral was in Bridgetown the following day, and he rested in a vault for 6 years, and then his body was exhumed and taken to England and to Oxford, where he is buried, with a black marble across saying simply Codrington. So that's the end of Codrington's life and all those involvements. And then we go on, and I won't go in as much detail, to the first years of struggle. A manning of the college, as I mentioned, the school for poor whites, disaster and upheaval that was happening at the time. There was a hurricane, major hurricane, 10th October 1780, that ran straight into Barbados and, of course, damaged the Codrington buildings extremely badly. Then there was abolitionist pressure and nonconformist influence, like the arrival of people like the Methodists and the Moravians, etc. The restructuring of education and getting a chaplain for the enslaved. You see, a lot of these things should have been done very earlier on in the will, but the place was going, really, the whole Codrington College was a bit chaotic until 1830. So although it has a date of 1745, things don't really become organized and productive until 1830, and of course that is towards the end of the slavery period. And talking of this Reverend William Gordon, he becomes this main source for everything that Codrington was supposed to have thought, and why he did this and why he did that. But throughout all the research, throughout the text, every reference is to Gordon. And one wonders, you know, how much of it is Gordon's imagination? How much of it is he cobbling together to give his good friend Christopher Codrington an extremely good name? But this guy, Reverend William Gordon, appears throughout in reference to advising people as to what Codrington really meant when he designed the bequest. And then we have a section on the scramble for souls, because by the 1820s, the British government has realized that, look, with emancipation coming, they were quite clear it would come, it is necessary because of fear of slave revolt and bad feeling between the planters and the officials and the enslaved, that we have to pump Christianity in a big way. And so we see the colonial office working with the Church of England to ensure that they develop this pattern system, establish dioceses, and I go into the whole creation of the diocese of 1825 with Bishop Coleridge and the effects. The first Bishop of Barbados was William Hart Coleridge. He was dispatched from England on a Royal Navy man-of-war in 1825. His mode of travel alone and the 21-gun salute that he received when his ship arrived in Carlisle Bay indicated the imperial nature of his appointment. After a few weeks in Barbados, he set out with a small entourage in the sloop Eden on a thorough inspection of the multi-island diocese. Once again, the tone of the church involvement was reflected in the sites that they visited in each island: churches, prisons, and residences of governors. And then you had, by 1830, the separation of the college from the school. Because they realized that they needed to concentrate entirely on the college. By that time, it was being recognized as a college within Durham University, and students were graduating from that university in the Caribbean. And the whole business of improving the character of the clergy, that is a feature of it. We see actually the momentum. All the things that should be happening from earlier in the 18th century were actually ending up happening in the middle of the 19th. And the Herculean efforts of Bishop Coleridge on all fronts was seriously tested by a so-called act of God in the form of the most devastating hurricane to hit Barbados during the 19th century. It slammed into the island on the morning of 11th August 1831, stripping the natural, agricultural, and built environment from the surface of the corals, terraces, and folded hillsides. And we got a very good description of this from the daughter of the then principal of Codrington College, Principal Pinder. But it just tells you the total damage, and when you think of Coleridge having built so many of these churches and then having to start again. And then the question of the compensation money, because by that time you're getting emancipation, and we have the first phase, of course, from 1834, and the apprenticeship and all that. And during those years, the British government paid out the promised compensation to slave owners under the Slave Compensation Act of 1837. The owners of enslaved laborers in the 1830s were as varied as the slaves they owned. The beneficiaries of the compensation money were not limited to absentee planters or plantation companies resident in the British Isles. Most were locally based masters and mistresses, nor were they all so-called White West Indians, but included free black and colored slaveholders and business people in town and country. And as has been repeatedly stated, it was the owners of the enslaved who were compensated, while those who had labored got nothing at all. The Church of England's Codrington plantations received £8,823, 8 shillings and 9 pence, representing the assessed value of its 411 slaves. According to the accounts of Codrington College, rather than going to any improvements of the lives of the enslaved, the compensation money was paid into the treasury of the college for repairs and continued upkeep. At least the SPG was not involved in an unsuccessful scam in Barbados, where some planters tried to petition the British government for monetary compensation for those of their slaves who had been killed in the hurricane of 1831, and therefore were not alive to be included in the emancipation compensation payments. They basically said if they had not been killed, they would be there and we would have got that money. So forget about the hurricane, forget about their deaths in the hurricane. I mean, the things that went on were quite remarkable. Emancipation, then the primary education that began in society and the efforts that were made there in the society primary school, religion for emancipation, and also Coleridge was very proud of his reduction of African beliefs. So we have West African beliefs transformed to Christianity. Or he mentions all the things about leaving gifts of food and drink and all that on the graves of the dead and all that. He got through wiping that out. And improving plantation living, making little plots, garden plots, and improving the land of the tenants. Legislation for order, the inspirational energy of Bishop Rawle. And here I go to, if there is any hero on Codrington College, for Codrington College, to be studied in relation to Codrington College, it is Bishop Rawle, Bishop Richard Rawle. For all the economic turbulence that would have affected Barbados during the latter half of the 19th century, both the Lodge and Codrington College charted new paths as they entered the decades of the 1830s. And Rawle's commitment was evident from the start. He resigned a fellowship at Trinity College, Cambridge at the age of 27, holding first-class honors in mathematics and an equally distinguished degree in classics to take up the challenge of Barbados in 1846. He served as principal until his death in 1889, with a gap of 17 years when he was the Bishop of Port of Spain in Trinidad. And then he also set up the Pongus Mission, which was for trained clerics at Codrington, people of African descent, to go and serve in West Africa. And that's dealt with as well. And Rawle's battle for survival of the college, because there were some Barbadian upper-class people who felt that if they continued with the college, they were producing a lot of local, i.e. colored clerics, and it would be better for them to just close the entire college, compress everything with the Lodge School, and have their clerics come from England, or even Barbadians trained in England coming through. Move on to 1917, and we have the success of the Lodge School boarding establishment, inspiring the principal and state to involve the college in founding another secondary school on these lands, this time for girls. A need had been expressed by leading Church of England families in the Eastern Caribbean for a school to provide good secondary education for their daughters. These islands lay within the Anglican Diocese of Bridgetown, and in most cases did not have schools which offered what was considered to be an adequate level of education. And then they wanted to separate quite clearly the Lodge School, Codrington Grammar School, Codrington Foundation School, whatever they called it, its various names. They wanted to separate it. So they bought this little estate attached to society called Small Ridge. And when they moved in, the chaplain's lodge, which was in Small Ridge, became the residence of the headmaster and also housed the first couple of classrooms as well as the sleeping quarters for the boarders. For this reason, it gradually became referred to as the Lodge School. And that was opened on March 25th, 1829. So that whole little estate, including the boiling house, which was converted to the first classrooms, etc. By this time, the whole education program in Barbados was speeding up. 1850, you had the first Education Act and grants for secondary schools. I have a section on education for empire because the British Empire was expanding at that time, and the syllabus and in fact the spirit of all of these schools, including Lodge, were geared at the empire and emphasizing people's place within that empire. And linked with this was the establishment of the Cadet Corps, the Lodge School Cadet Corps in 1903, which became the first Cadet Corps on the island. I go into the school symbols, which are fascinating, but I won't deal with them here. That is the crest with the seahorse and various other aspects of the school song, and the song exhorts the students to be united in the memory of the history of the school and their ancestors associated with it, contained in the opening line, "Here we stand where our fathers standing." The song was written by a teacher. Also the crest, and so devised by the wife of the rector of St. John. And then we move towards the end with the college into the 20th century and the challenges never ending that were there. Social transformation and the fact that the University of the West Indies eventually took over by recommendations of various commissions that had been held. The Asquith Commission and the Irving Commission were some of the main ones. And so Durham removed itself and the University of the West Indies took over. And in the 1950s, remarkably, a monastic and celibate religious order was installed. So in the end, Codrington did get his idea put in place in the 1950s, when this order, very unusual Anglican order, the Community of the Resurrection of Mirfield in England, of celibate priests, and it was a religious order quite accurately referred to as a monastic order, founded in 1892, that worked in Britain and South Africa. And they were focused on training priests. And then the local trust, deal with the emergence of the local trust to manage it, the Codrington Trust Act that revised the management of the Codrington properties. And that was 1st October 1983, the Codrington Trust was promulgated in the Barbados Parliament. I don't go into the details here. We lead in the tourism attraction, and a group of people who got together to try to save Codrington College and devising other uses for it along with its educational purposes. Well, we have right here Sir Henry Fraser, who was very active at that time in trying to maintain, develop, promote the college for alternative uses, particularly as a visitor site and that kind of thing. And the new buildings and the free education that came into Barbados in 1959 through the New Education Act. All of this kind of revolutionized not only the Lodge School, but others. I deal with the independence decade and, revising from the colonial mindset, from the Barbados and the Empire to the independence movement and the programs related to the boys learning about the coat of arms and the flag and the national anthem, all of which as a student I was involved with. And so at the end I say that at a lecture delivered in the new auditorium at the Lodge School on the 8th of September 2019 to launch the 275th anniversary of the commencement of the school and college, I suggested that the lack of recognition for the enslaved who had worked for years and years, after all they have plaques of those who lost their lives in the 2 world wars, why not also have this basically resolve this lack of recognition be rectified with a plaque at each place, the college and the Lodge School, engraved with suitable words, so as to record and reflect contribution of these unlisted hundreds. In doing so, I submitted a draft open to adaptation and rewording by others, which could read something like, in memory and gratitude of those who worked in slavery on the Codrington plantations, to deliver the will of Christopher Codrington for the benefit of students. And that is how the book ends. I hope I haven't dragged you through too much information, but I just wanted to give you a reflection on what is contained within the book. And when you get it, if you do get it, you can read it in more detail. So thank you very much. There are lots of interesting little side stories in there, but that's for the reading. I don't know whether anybody would like to ask any questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, before you start, I would like you to use your microphones. I'm going to bring them to you in order to ask questions so that our online audience can hear your questions. Thank you once again to Dr. Honychurch for his words. I believe Dr. Henry had his hand up first.
Thank you very much. Lennox, 2 things, but just one for the moment. 36 years ago, at a National Trust hike, we came up from Concept Bay to the back of the college, across the lawns, and we saw 4-foot cedar trees growing out of the gutters and the roofs. Most of the guttering had gone, windows were broken, the building was in disarray. And I formed a committee the following week at the National Trust, and with Jill Shepherd's dynamic efforts, we raised $1 million for the restoration of the college. We built the car park and did many other things. I understand that 36 years later, the college buildings are now in an even worse state. And therefore, I hope that this event, your lecture and everything else, can be used to raise another $1 million, because it is clear that those in charge of the management of the trust have once again fallen down completely, as the SPG did over so many centuries. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I do go into more detail with efforts that you and Jill Shepherd and others did at that time as a result of that. And I myself was there just a couple weeks ago, if not a week ago, and I was alarmed to see the ficus getting into the walls and growing into the valleys of the roofs, and the ferns rooted once again into the walls, being nurtured by the rainwater coming out of the broken guttering. So yes, I fully support you on that there's a need for some heavy maintenance and continual, continual, so that this does not happen again.
Good afternoon, Dr. Honychurch. What was the most surprising aspect of Codrington's life that you discovered during your research for the book?
One is, where did he get this idea of running a plantation financed by slavery? And for the first time I came across the references in the work of this Père Labat. But you see, Codrington himself admitted that, the Roman Catholic Church had all these various denominations within them. That is, the various, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, that were committed entirely to maintaining the, call it the theological colleges. And in the Code Noir of 1685, it stipulated that all the enslaved should be made Christians, of course, under the Roman Catholic Church, and there should be prayers every morning, and they should be celebrating the feast days. And that's one of the first times that I came across the influence that these, particularly this Père Labat, had on Codrington, and the fact that they were keeping in touch all the time to try to, because essentially what he said in some other note that he gave to this William Gordon is that, you know, the celibate priests of the Roman Catholic Church are entirely committed to this. There's no deviation to other things. And his concern, which I knew already about the priests in Barbados from very early on being diverted by the planters. And they were paid in sugar, and there was all this complication about weighing the sugar and making sure how the priests could be paid in sugar and stuff like that. So that was one of the main points of interest for me. Where did he get this idea? He had been introduced to it by Père Labat and the other missionaries that he conversed with in Martinique and St. Kitts, which of course was divided between the English and the French. So that was one of the main things. And then there was this other thing of, you see, sometimes like Parker, I forget his first name, he wrote this book about the sugar barons. Matthew, sorry, say Parker. And Matthew Parker, yes? So fine. And he writes about all of them, Drax and Codringtons and all. And sometimes these books kind of focus on the more exotic, outrageous sections. And then when you see the other side, that he's trying, he realizes that his father has been very much the kind of person that is represented in the sugar barons, but he now tries to rope himself in, draw himself in from that kind of behavior, you know. But there again, I mean, there is no, he goes 2 or 3 times, I mentioned it, where he is concerned about the fact that he has to raise, the people to whom he bequeaths this have to be able to raise money, and the only way they can raise money is through slavery. And so they have to maintain the slavery, and that he's concerned about the planters, that if he did put in his will anything about amelioration, or God forbid about emancipation, or whatever, his entire will would have been basically ignored, and it would have been put to William, his nephew. Everything would have gone to William, the nephew. So those little things come in, but you're quite right. As I went along, my image of Codrington that had been given to me at the Lodge School certainly was torn up and revised as a result of the more detailed work of the research. Most of which, I must say, is actually in Antigua. All of that, because he spent so much time in Antigua, and his duties as Governor General of the islands and Commander-in-Chief, all of that is focused there. Thanks for that.
Yeah, Lennox, my first question is quite frivolous. This tank at Codrington swimming, presumably that's not the pond that's still there.
No.
Where was this tank then?
The tank, it's a very sad situation, and I think an unnecessary demolition. So when we went in, it was probably if you take that section of the buildings, and maybe even the width of that building, it was a wall that high surrounding the entire tank. There was a little platform on which you changed and hung your towels. And then there was one door, heavy-duty wooden door with a tower bolt. And once you got in there, because this thing had been built in the 18th century, and I think the idea was that you got in there, took off all your clothes, and swam around and soaked yourself. So, you know, it was a communal bath. And it suited us for the swimming, although it wasn't really the ideal situation. It was a proper swimming pool. But what happened, it's kind of to the east of the main buildings, and apparently, I haven't been able to find the exact date, but certainly in this century, in the 20s, a student dived in. I don't know why, because everybody knew that it was only about 4 feet deep. He dived in, hit his head, cracked everything, and broke his backbone, and died.
The pool had been drained.
And the pool had been drained, so it was empty then.
It was empty. And it was a dark night.
Oh, it was a night.
Went down on his own.
Ah,
Did not appreciate that it was empty and killed himself.
okay.
Okay, one last question for me, and that is this idea that Barbados was a kind of breeding station for the enslaved or slaves to be. Is that true?
No,
Or
that has been by international academics, including including some of the people who have studied Barbuda very, very closely. No, it's a myth. What the thing was with Barbuda, it was basically a supply zone for food for the Codrington plantations on Antigua. And the enslaved people on Barbuda were more or less left unto themselves. And they planted lots of crops, food, both for the plantations in Antigua, but also for themselves. They had the freedom to go and go on the reefs and get everything from lobsters to conch and everything. So they were big. They always had a reputation of being big, healthy people. That was what it was that led to the story that it was a slave, what shall I say now, a slave production factory, if you want, you know. But there is no when you deeply research it, proof. David Lowenthal is the name I was looking for. Because in 1981, when all the records of the Codrington papers were being auctioned in England, he was one that pushed very heavily that those papers should be bought and brought to Antigua. And it is in all those papers, you don't see anything related to it. But unfortunately, like other Caribbean instances, those papers are in a very bad condition. Because a building, archives building was built, and the letters and papers of the Codringtons at Barbuda were purchased by auction. It is believed by Paul Mellon, the multi-millionaire, if not billionaire, and that that they're there in Antigua, but under very bad conditions. And it is those papers that show that this is a story, fanciful story, but it doesn't have the backing of proof.
We're going to take one last question from the audience, and then Ms. Sally Miller is going to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Lennox, I think this is a fair question. When I was at school, my mentor was Sir Alexander Hoyes, Father
Yes.
Hoyes, as we called him.
Yes.
I was inspired by the will, the very words, to train young men in physics and chirurgery and theology.
Yes.
So that being able to heal their bodies, they would be better equipped to save their souls.
Right.
Okay? I became a doctor as a result of that will. And I know a number of other doctors over the last century who were similarly inspired. My father-in-law trained at Codrington College, went to Antigua and taught in Antigua. Now, Codrington has trained priests, teachers, administrators, lawyers, even Dukes of Grade, the Royal Astronomer. So I put it to you, is there any other single person in the English-speaking Caribbean who has done more for the development of the wider Caribbean than Christopher Codrington III?
I know that's a theory of yours, but it's one thing to leave a will. It's another thing to stay in, in the trenches and get that thing done. And really, my respect goes to Richard Roll, because he's going to write a will and die, and that's the end of it. But how much have you really done towards achieving these ideals that you have. But I mean, there are other wills, but it would be, you know, difficult to maybe pinpoint somebody. I mean, one of the people I greatly admire was Lord Guinness and the Moyne Commission report. I mean, that really transformed the Caribbean. And poor Lord Moyne got blown up in Cairo by the Israeli Haganah because he was about to solve the whole problem of Palestine because he had done such a good job in the West Indies. Yes. But I can't go to the length that you have gone. But I see your point in a way. Here's a will. So many people, I mentioned a lot of their names there. They weren't necessarily, particularly from the under the Durham agreement, they were not necessarily clerics, but they went on to many other things around the world, around the British Empire, for instance. So yes, I can see your point. Let's put it that way. But I think the argument would have to be a bit stronger in relation to have done more for the British West Indies than any other. So that is it. And the thing is, Sir Henry, that it has been shown, and I mention it somewhere here, that really for all the ideals there is no record of the medical aspect being a success or that any great number were influenced by it. Yeah. There's a book entirely on that subject, Doctors and Slaves, which brings up that. I won't try to find it, but basically saying that's the case. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Okay.
at this time, I'm going to invite Ms. Calabella to take the stage. And do stick around for after the vote of thanks because I hear there's rum punch. And of course, Dr. Honychurch is going to sign your copies of the book as well. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, he gets passed through.
Well, Alessandra, the director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and Deputy Kevin, for inviting us here this evening and making this all possible. It was very much their idea, and we appreciate it. And Lennox, thank you so much. He makes it look so easy and effortless, and I can assure you it is anything but. He sweats bullets over it. He is a bundle of nerves when I pick him up today, and it takes a lot of nervous energy and a lot of effort and concentration. So, thank you, sir. You can now relax. And lastly, to thank you all for coming, for your support this afternoon. You will be rewarded with some rum punch and sorrel that I made, and the books are on sale. Thank you.
So I found this little, I'm not fine, but I had a good digging, right? So if this plug into here, I think the last thing she had said she had to do something and she had to change something from something from something.